My name is Tim Carter. This video is about the field of translation, which I'm not really certain how to describe that. There's theory and practice in translation. A young man recently in dialogue as current as today about translation, and I informed him that translation, that is the theory and practice, is not within the science of hermeneutics. What is within the science of hermeneutics would be called the lexical syntactical analysis, which results in grammatical syntactical inflection. Now, inflection is just a nicer word. There's inflectional morphemes. We call those the prefixes, affixes, or suffixes. For example, there's 7 stems in 2 states of the Hebrew language. There's simple active action, there's simple passive, intensive active, intensive passive, intensive reflexive, causative active, causative passive. Now that's basically the inflectional categories from which you receive the morphemes that will then agree with number, gender, case, or as in the Hebrew language, when it comes to the verb, is it a perfect state? That is it affix state, complete action, or is it imperfect, incomplete, prefix state? And knowing that, then it won't startle anyone when you, let's say, read something that's been written according to the inflectional morphemes or highly inflected language. Someone once, not as an accusation, but I've had plenty of those, but someone said something about correction of, let's say, modern translations, especially the 17th century's famous King James Version, and I have to remind them I don't know what I would do with a corrected King James Bible. Really, I don't know what that would do, but they didn't mean it. They just hopped on the latest thing that would give them a name or a reason to lash out in negativity. But when I explained to them it was inflection, and that if you word it out as it's written, some people call it a mechanical translation, which if you read those, it's really not necessarily even close sometimes. For example, when you include causative or even the word cause, as English translations do in some places, sparsely though, but if every time it's a simple active, you just demonstrate that, explain it or write it out. So if you're speaking, it's definitely not a translation, but we do speak in translation. We translate thoughts and ideas and meanings, and hermeneutics is more about defining. It's more about bringing definitions to words and the implications. For example, in Koine, emphasis is on kind of action, which is a rather big deal in with certain verbs, like believe, for example. It's a large matter when it's important. I don't know of anyone that makes a big deal out of the difference between writing or write. So that would be according to the inflection. And when you write it out, word it out, people will call it a translation, but then they'll say they don't know of any translation theory or practice that supports that. Well, that's really probably why I really like a word for it, because mechanical translation is an attempt, I suppose, and then some people say an expanded or amplified or word for word, but it isn't that when you really look at it, because I know it's almost startling to people. As I was trained, you could actually take what we wrote out in English, look at it, and if it were from a Hebrew passage of the Old Testament, you could look at it and say that's a cal imperfect, and you could literally conjugate that verb, or you could say that's a hifil perfect or imperfect, and you could go ahead and conjugate, of course, by its person and number, or if it's a noun, you could see and know it's plural or singular. It's number, that is. Well, anyway, long story short is don't really know the word for it. So I've even asked someone who's still at our seminary to find out was there ever a word for grammatical, syntactical inflection when we speak and explain it, as I do when I preach from any Old Testament passage. Let's say it's an intensive stem, we'll add the adverb intensely to show that and communicate it. If it's reflexive, we'll put for himself, a reflexive pronoun, for example. Intensely, there's an intensive reflexive. So we'll include that when we're communicating it. Now, none of that, I've talked with people, young man that was involved in Wycliffe Translators, and he never heard anything I was saying. So when you're actually trying to communicate through, in words, the thought process of Greek or Hebrew, you're really talking about the grammar, the syntax, and all the inflectional morphemes that go with it. And what that's called is literally not trying to translate it, but trying to prevent it from being translated. You're trying to preserve it as you transfer it to someone else. So that would be more of a transmission theory, the way we transmit it to someone else, because if we're really just working on translating it so someone can understand whatever it is in the way they do it, you're bending the language. You might have to abandon the logic, some of the inflectional morphemes, which you'll notice many people do that. A lot of translators ignore kinds of action. They may translate believeth from Old English in a New English translation, may say believe or believing, and it not be, when it's believeth is used for believe, they may translate it believing, and when believeth is used for believing, they may translate it believe. So they ignore the original action emphasized in the Koine text. So that might be why it's called translation, in the sense that it has rules that aren't there to assure that the inflection and the intention of the words causative, active, causative, passive, perfect, imperfect states, for example, are actually transmitted to the hearer. So I guess I'm not really a translator in that sense. I would be a transmitter. And that would probably help people understand why, according to rules of hermeneutics and apologetics, I wouldn't want to abandon the inflectional morphemes, because then on a global scale, and we found it second to no one, the unsurpassed logic and the superiority of God's original inflections, the inflectional morphemes and the models of those, such as Greek, Hebrew, conjugated verb forms, strong forms, and then kinds of action emphasized in the Koine. So anyway, that's enough. It's just transmitter is probably more correct in trying to explain to people, when we who are scientists in the field of hermeneutics say that we're not really translators in that sense. That's where a lot of battles between originalists and textualists came throughout history, with Bible societies, the issues of translation, because we were there to say, how do we have in this translation what's necessary to transmit according to the inflectional morphemes of the original languages. And of course, we were pushed aside, as all originalists and textualists are. So the good news is, when the day is now dawned where in fields of hermeneutics and apologetics, these inflectional morphemes now demonstrate fallacies, fallible elements within, for example, major religious constructs such as Calvinism, Arminianism, Molinism, Rapturism. All of those, without the inflectional morphemes and adherence to those models according to which those inflectional elements are communicated, they're lost in transmission. So people just go on and further away from the origins of those fallacies or fallible constructs, how they began. It just gets bigger and bigger, until now there's 5 forms of Rapturism, perhaps more, of which I'm not yet aware. There's endless forms of Calvinism, Arminianism, Molinism. There's all of them are hyper, high, moderate, low, and really it all depends on whomever is there wanting to make issue out of any of them. But if you ever find out something interesting about religions, they'll accuse each other over things which aren't true, which is You know, it's strange because I've learned that the more I know, as my pastor, Dr. Lynn Baxter, taught me, you'll find less accusations coming from people who know more, because you understand first how gullible you were in things we've all heard in our lifetime and how we pick things up. So as people, we're very gullible. Jesus warned his people, children of God, that we were gullible to the leaven, the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, and that we were receptive to the leaven of the kingdom of God. They don't receive that, we do, but they aren't susceptible to the truth, but we're susceptible to the lie. And that's why it's difficult when you teach about the parables of leaven. You come away and you learn that we're the ones susceptible to the leaven of error, not those who are dispensing it susceptible to the leaven of truth. So would that it worked that way. So have a good day, and have a blessed day, and enjoy this. But I'm more of a transmitter, and hopefully that'll help clarify for people who want to talk about translations. I don't subscribe. When I began to read Translation Theory and Practice, it didn't follow any of the rules of hermeneutics, so toss that away and remain true to the more repeatable, always repeatable, consistent process of communicating inflectional morpheme. So that's it. Have a good day.